Hidden deep within an ancient forest lies Stillwood, a village trapped in eternal twilight and shadowed by a chilling legend. Every winter solstice, children begin to disappear, taken by something that moves in the snow and whispers in the night. When Amelia, a schoolteacher fleeing her past, arrives in Stillwood seeking refuge, she discovers the village's grim secret. As the solstice approaches and more children vanish, Amelia must unravel the mystery of the forest and confront the ancient force that dwells within it before the next child disappears forever. Amelia adjusted her scarf against the biting wind as the bus creaked to a stop at the edge of the forest road. A crooked wooden sign stood nearby, half buried in the snow. "Welcome to Stillwood." The driver, a gruff man with tired eyes, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Are you sure, miss? This place, it's not friendly to strangers." "I'll be fine," Amelia said, clutching her worn leather bag. The driver hesitated, then sighed and opened the door. "Good luck, then." Amelia stepped off the bus, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The bus door hissed shut behind her, and moments later, it was gone, leaving her alone in the swirling cold. Ahead, the village of Stillwood waited, its rooftops barely visible through the dense veil of falling snow. Stillwood was unlike any village Amelia had ever seen. The houses were ancient and crooked, their dark wooden beams twisted with age. Lanterns hung from posts, their faint golden glow flickering weakly in the wind. The village square was empty, the snow untouched except for a set of small footprints leading toward the forest edge. She made her way to the Silver Pine Inn, the only building with lights still glowing from its windows. The door creaked as she entered, and warmth hit her like a wave. Behind the counter stood a stout woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression. "You must be Amelia," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're the new school teacher, aren't you?" Amelia nodded, setting her bag down. "Yes, I'm here to start fresh." The woman eyed her carefully. "You picked a strange place for a fresh start, miss." Amelia settled into her small, creaky room on the inn's upper floor. The walls were thin, and she could hear the faint sound of children laughing somewhere outside. But when she peered through the frost-covered window, the streets below were empty. The innkeeper, who had introduced herself as Martha, explained little about the village, other than a stern warning. "Don't go near the woods after sunset, and don't listen to the voices." Voices? Amelia shook her head. It had to be superstition. Stillwood was isolated, and isolation often bred strange beliefs. The next day, Amelia started her job at the village school. The building was old but well kept, with a single classroom and a wood-burning stove at the back. The children were quiet, their faces pale and wary. They avoided meeting her eyes, and when she asked questions, their answers were short and mumbled. Only one child spoke freely, a bright-eyed girl named Elsie, no older than 8. "Miss Amelia?" Elsie asked during their midday break. "Yes, Elsie." "Do you believe in the snow people?" Amelia frowned. "The snow people?" Elsie nodded solemnly. "They come from the woods when the snow is deepest. They take children away, and no one ever sees them again." The other children shushed her, their eyes darting toward the frosted windows. "Enough of that," Amelia said gently. "Let's focus on our lesson." But the uneasy silence in the classroom lingered long after the conversation ended. That night, Amelia found herself unable to sleep. The inn was too quiet, the wind outside carrying faint, almost melodic whispers. She wrapped herself in a shawl and went downstairs. Martha was still awake, sitting by the fireplace with a cup of tea. "Can't sleep?" Martha asked without looking up. Amelia shook her head. "The children, they mentioned something today. About snow people." Martha's face tightened. "You shouldn't listen to their stories. Children have wild imaginations." "But they were so serious about it," Amelia pressed. "Elsie said they take children away." Martha sighed heavily, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Sometimes children go missing in Stillwood. It's always during winter, always during the solstice." Amelia's stomach turned. "And no one investigates?" No one tries to stop it? What would we do, miss? Martha's voice was hollow. There's something in those woods. Something older than this village. We offer what we can. Sometimes it's enough. Sometimes it isn't. The next morning, chaos erupted in the village. A child had gone missing. Little Toby, a quiet boy with dark curls and wide eyes, had vanished overnight. His parents stood in the square, clutching each other, their faces streaked with tears. Amelia watched from the steps of the inn as a small search party, armed with lanterns and old hunting rifles, ventured into the woods. Will they find him? She asked Martha. Martha shook her head. They never do. The day passed in tense silence. The children at school were restless, their eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. Elsie sat quietly at her desk, clutching a small wooden doll in her hands. After class, Amelia approached her. Elsie, did Toby ever talk about the woods? Did he say anything strange before he disappeared? Elsie hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. He said he heard them calling. The snow people. They sing to you. In the dark. Amelia felt a chill crawl down her spine. What do they want, Elsie? Elsie's eyes filled with tears. They want us to join them. That night, Amelia stood at her window, staring at the forest edge. The snow glittered under the pale moonlight, and the village lay eerily quiet. Then she heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind. It was soft, melodic, almost beautiful. Singing. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the window. And there, at the edge of the woods, she saw a figure. Small, fragile, standing barefoot in the snow. It was Toby, his head tilted up toward the sky, his lips moving as though he were singing along with the sound that drifted through the night. Amelia's breath caught. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed her coat and hurried downstairs. Martha's voice rang out behind her. Don't go out there! But Amelia was already outside, her boots sinking into the snow as she ran toward the boy. Toby! She called, her voice sharp and desperate. But Toby didn't move. The singing grew louder, swelling around her like a choir of frozen voices. The wind howled and the trees seemed to shift in the dark. Then Toby turned to face her. His eyes were blank, glassy, like twin shards of ice. Join us, he whispered. And behind him, the shadows in the trees began to move. Amelia froze, her breath clouding in the icy air as she stared at Toby. His wide, glassy eyes reflected the faint moonlight, and his lips still moved in that silent, haunting song. Behind him, shadows shifted between the trees. They were tall, impossibly thin, their forms blending with the frost-covered branches. Their pale faces, if they could even be called faces, were smooth and empty, like masks carved from ice. Join us, Toby whispered again, his voice hollow and distant. The singing grew louder, wrapping around Amelia like a frozen fog. Her mind felt sluggish, her body heavy, as if the cold had seeped into her very bones. But somewhere deep in her chest, a spark of clarity flared. No, she choked out, taking a step back. Toby, come here, come back with me. The boy didn't move. One of the shadowy figures extended a hand, its long, skeletal fingers reaching toward Toby. No! Amelia screamed, lunging forward. The wind roared and the world seemed to blur. When Amelia opened her eyes, she was lying face down in the snow. Her coat was soaked, and her fingers were numb from the cold. The forest was silent again, the singing gone. Toby was nowhere to be seen. She pushed herself up, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded in her ears as she scanned the edge of the woods, but the boy and the figures had vanished. The only evidence they had ever been there were faint footprints in the snow, leading deeper into the forest. Back at the inn, Martha met her at the door. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of anger and fear. You went out there, she said, her voice trembling. You went after him. Amelia pushed past her, collapsing into one of the chairs by the fire. Her body shook uncontrollably, whether from the cold or from fear, she couldn't tell. I saw him, Martha. Toby. He was standing there, in the snow, and there were things. shadows in the trees. They were calling him. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line as she set a steaming mug in front of Amelia. "You're lucky you made it back." Amelia's hands shook as she wrapped them around the mug. "What are they, Martha? What's happening here?" The innkeeper sighed, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "They're called the Frostborn," she said softly. "Spirits of children taken by the cold, cursed to wander the woods forever. They lure others to join them, to grow their numbers." Amelia's stomach turned. "But why children?" Martha's eyes were distant. "Because children are pure, innocent. The forest takes what it thinks belongs to it." The following day, the village was cloaked in a heavy silence. Parents clutched their children tightly, their eyes filled with dread as they glanced toward the forest. At the schoolhouse, Amelia tried to keep the children focused on their lessons, but the tension was suffocating. Elsie sat at her desk, clutching her wooden doll so tightly her knuckles were white. "Miss Amelia," she said quietly as the other children worked. Amelia knelt beside her. "What is it?" "Elsie." "I heard them last night," Elsie whispered, her voice trembling. "The Frostborn. They were singing outside my window. They said they were coming for me." Amelia's chest tightened. "Elsie, listen to me. You're safe here, okay? I won't let anything happen to you." But Elsie's wide eyes told her that the little girl didn't believe her. And deep down, Amelia wasn't sure she believed herself. That night, Amelia stayed awake, sitting by her window and staring out into the snow-covered village square. The lanterns flickered weakly in the wind, their light barely holding back the darkness. The forest loomed in the distance, a jagged wall of shadow against the pale moonlight. Then she heard it again. The singing. It was faint at first, like a breeze passing through frozen branches, but it grew louder, more melodic, wrapping itself around the village like an icy veil. Amelia pressed her forehead against the glass, scanning the square below. And then she saw them, a line of children, barefoot and dressed in thin nightgowns, walking slowly toward the forest. Their heads were bowed, their eyes blank and glassy. At the front of the line was Elsie, clutching her wooden doll in one frozen hand. "No!" Amelia gasped, grabbing her coat and rushing downstairs. Martha appeared in the hallway, her face pale with fear. "Don't go after them, Amelia. You'll only make it worse." "They have Elsie," Amelia snapped, pulling open the door and stepping out into the freezing night. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she sprinted toward the line of children. The singing grew louder, more oppressive, wrapping itself around her like chains of frost. "Elsie!" she shouted. "Elsie, stop!" The little girl didn't react. She walked forward, her movements slow and dreamlike, her doll dangling limply from her fingers. "Yeah!" The children crossed the village square and stepped into the trees. Amelia followed, her breath coming in sharp, icy gasps. The forest was darker than she remembered, the trees pressing close together like silent sentinels. The snow muffled her footsteps, and the singing grew louder with every step she took. Ahead, the line of children continued their slow, steady march. The shadows of the Frostborn moved among them, their thin, skeletal forms gliding silently across the snow. Amelia's pulse thundered in her ears. She had to stop them. She had to save Elsie. But then she felt it. A presence. It was old and cold and vast, pressing down on her like the weight of a glacier. The trees seemed to tremble in its wake, their frost-covered branches groaning softly. Amelia looked up and saw it. At the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and twisted, its roots sprawling across the snow like the gnarled fingers of a corpse. Hanging from its branches were faint, glowing shapes, like lanterns made of ice. And standing at its base was something worse than the Frostborn. A figure cloaked in frost and shadow, its face obscured by a mask of ice. Its hollow voice carried across the clearing like a cold wind. "They belong to me." The children began to kneel, one by one, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Amelia's chest heaved as she stepped forward, her voice trembling. "No, they don't belong to you." The figure turned its masked face toward her, and the temperature plummeted. They were promised. You should not have come here. Amelia's knees buckled, but she stayed upright. I'm taking Elsie. And I'm taking the others too. The figure's hollow laughter echoed through the clearing. Then you will join them. The shadows shifted, and the Frostborn began to close in around her. Amelia glanced at Elsie, her small face pale and frozen, her wooden doll clutched tightly in her hand. There was only one chance, one moment to act. Amelia lunged forward, grabbing Elsie by the arm. Run! She screamed. The Frostborn shrieked, their whispers turning into a deafening roar as the forest itself seemed to close in around them. Amelia's boots pounded against the snow as she pulled Elsie through the tangled roots and icy branches. The whispers of the Frostborn echoed all around her, weaving through the trees like a frozen fog. Stay. Join us. You cannot run. The air felt heavier with every step, as though the forest itself were trying to pull her back. Elsie stumbled, clutching her wooden doll in one frozen hand while her other hand was locked in Amelia's grip. Keep going, Elsie, Amelia urged, her breath forming frantic clouds in the icy air. Don't stop, no matter what. Behind them, the Frostborn were closing in. Their tall, skeletal forms glided over the snow, their blank faces glowing faintly in the moonlight. The ancient figure, the one cloaked in frost and shadow, watched silently from the clearing, its presence a weight that pressed against Amelia's chest. The whispers grew louder, more violent. Give her to us! She is ours! Amelia's lungs burned as she pushed forward, her feet slipping on the uneven ground. The forest grew denser, the branches clawing at her coat and hair. The cold gnawed at her fingers, sharp and unrelenting. But then, a faint light flickered ahead, a lantern glow cutting through the dark. They burst into a small clearing. A ruined stone chapel, its roof caved in and walls cracked with age, stood in the center. Its windows glowed faintly with a flickering light, and an old bell tower loomed above, silhouetted against the moon. Amelia pulled Elsie inside and slammed the heavy wooden door behind them. She braced her body against it, her breath ragged as she listened for the whispers outside. The Frostborn had stopped at the edge of the clearing. Their pale forms lingered between the trees, their hollow faces turned toward the chapel. The ancient figure stood motionless among them, its frost-covered mask catching the faint moonlight. But they didn't enter. Amelia turned to Elsie, dropping to her knees. Are you hurt? Are you okay? Elsie nodded, her blue eyes wide with fear. They almost had me, Miss Amelia. They were calling me. Amelia wrapped her arms around her tightly, her voice soft but firm. You're safe now. I won't let them take you. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure they were true. The chapel was cold and filled with shadows. The flickering light came from an old lantern hanging crookedly from a wooden beam. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of wax and ash. Amelia spotted an old altar at the far end, covered in faded cloth and surrounded by scattered remnants of offerings, withered flowers, cracked candles, and small wooden figurines. At the base of the altar lay something else, a journal, its leather cover cracked and frostbitten. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the brittle pages. The handwriting was hurried, desperate. The Frostborn cannot cross holy ground. The chapel keeps them at bay, but it cannot hold them forever. They sing, they whisper, they promise warmth in the cold. Do not listen, do not answer. The next entry was smeared with ink and nearly unreadable. The forest takes children because they are easy to break. Pure souls, untouched by corruption. The figure in the clearing, it is their master, their shepherd, but it is also their prison. It cannot leave the woods unless it is invited. Amelia's stomach churned. Invited? Had someone, intentionally or accidentally, let this happen? She flipped to the final page. The solstice is the key. It's when their power is strongest, but also when they are vulnerable. The frost binds them, the altar binds them. Break the connection, and the curse might break too. Her eyes flicked to the altar. Its surface was etched with strange runes. faintly glowing beneath a thin layer of frost. "Miss Amelia?" Elsie's small voice broke the silence. Amelia turned. The little girl was staring out one of the shattered windows, her face pale. "They're still there, watching us." Amelia followed her gaze. Outside, the Frostborn stood perfectly still, their empty faces turned toward the chapel. The figure at the edge of the clearing raised one skeletal hand, pointing directly at the building. The whispers began again, faint and melodic, vibrating in Amelia's skull. "Time is running out. The solstice is here. Join us, or they will all suffer." Amelia's hand clenched around the journal. The altar binds them. Her eyes went back to the stone altar at the far end of the chapel. If the journal was right, this was the key. But breaking it, what would that mean? Would it free them? Would it end the curse? Or would it unleash something far worse? She had no choice. "Elsie," Amelia said, her voice trembling but steady, "I need you to stay here. No matter what happens, do not leave this chapel. Do you understand me?" Elsie's lip quivered, but she nodded. "Are you going to stop them?" Amelia forced a smile. "I'm going to try." She stepped toward the altar, her boots echoing on the frozen stone floor. The glow of the runes grew brighter as she approached, pulsating faintly beneath the frost. She reached out and placed her hand on the cold surface of the altar. A sudden sharp pain shot through her palm, as though the stone itself had bitten her. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. The whispers grew louder, and the Frostborn outside began to move. They glided closer to the chapel, their hollow faces pressed against the broken windows. "Do not break it. You do not understand. This binds us all." The figure in the clearing raised both arms, and the wind roared like a living thing, battering the walls of the chapel. The lantern overhead swung violently, casting wild shadows across the stone. Amelia gritted her teeth and pushed harder against the altar. The frost began to crack beneath her palm, spider webbing across the surface. The glow of the runes grew chaotic, flickering like a dying star. Outside, the Frostborn screamed. With a final push, Amelia drove her hand into the altar, shattering the frost-covered stone. A blinding light erupted from the cracks, illuminating the chapel with an unnatural glow. The Frostborn shrieked, their hollow cries rising into a deafening chorus as their forms began to disintegrate, scattering like ash on the wind. The ancient figure let out a sound, low and mournful, like the groan of a glacier breaking apart. Its frost-covered mask cracked, splitting down the center before the figure itself crumbled into the snow. The storm outside howled one final time, and then there was silence. Amelia collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving, her hand bleeding where it had pressed against the altar. The glow faded, and the whispers were gone. Elsie's small voice cut through the silence. "Miss Amelia? Is it over?" Amelia turned, her breath catching as she saw the girl standing at the edge of the altar. The forest was quiet. The air felt still. "I think it is," Amelia said softly. "No, no." But as she glanced out the shattered windows at the silent, snow-covered forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deep and ancient was still watching, waiting. The silence in the chapel was absolute. The frost on the walls had stopped spreading, the oppressive cold beginning to lift. Outside, the snow lay still, untouched by the shadows that had once glided across it. The forest, for the first time since Amelia had arrived, felt asleep. Amelia knelt by the shattered altar, her hand throbbing from where the frostbitten stone had bitten into her palm. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. Behind her, Elsie clutched her wooden doll, her small frame trembling as she stared at the ruins of the altar. "Miss Amelia? Did we win?" Elsie's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Amelia forced herself to look up at the little girl, her expression both gentle and weary. I think so, Elsie. I think it's over." But even as she said the words, a chill prickled at the back of her neck. The forest was silent, but it was not peaceful. It was watching. The two of them stepped out of the chapel into the pale morning light. The sky was still overcast, but the thick blanket of snow reflected a faint glow from somewhere above. The Frostborn were gone. The figure in the mask was gone. But the trees still loomed. Their gnarled branches stretched skyward, frozen in place, and the forest seemed to exhale a slow, heavy breath. "Where do we go now?" Elsie asked, her voice trembling. Amelia scanned the horizon. Through the thinning snowfall, she could see faint shapes in the distance. Rooftops, lanterns, the outline of the village. "We're going home," Amelia said firmly. "Back to the village. Back to the others." Elsie took her hand, clutching it tightly as they began to walk. The village square was eerily quiet when they arrived. The lanterns had burned out, their wicks blackened. The snow in the square was untouched, pristine, as though no one had walked there in years. Martha emerged from the inn, her face pale with disbelief. "You came back." The other villagers slowly stepped out of their homes, their expressions a mix of fear, hope, and confusion. "They're gone," Amelia said, her voice carrying across the square. "The Frostborn, the figure. I broke the altar. I think it's over." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman clutched her child tightly to her chest, tears streaming down her face. An older man removed his hat and looked toward the forest, his lips moving in silent prayer. Martha stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "You saved her," she said, looking at Elsie. "You saved us all?" Amelia nodded, but a hollow feeling settled in her chest. The weight of the forest's presence still lingered. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. Martha's smile faltered. "We can only hope." The village slowly began to stir back to life. Fires were lit in hearths, food was shared among neighbors, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed faintly through the square. But not everyone had been saved. Small wooden carvings were placed on the steps of the church, a quiet memorial for the children who had been taken, their names whispered by grieving parents and siblings. Amelia stood at the edge of the square, her gaze fixed on the forest. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky had lightened to a pale gray. But the forest remained dark, still, watching. Days passed, and the village returned to something resembling normalcy. Amelia resumed her work at the school, and the children slowly began to smile again. But Elsie stayed close to Amelia, rarely leaving her side. Her bright eyes were still filled with fear whenever she glanced toward the forest. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of gold and purple, Elsie spoke softly. "Miss Amelia, do you think they'll ever come back?" Amelia hesitated, her hands pausing over the papers on her desk. "I don't know, Elsie. I hope not." Elsie looked down at her wooden doll. "But they're still out there, aren't they? In the trees?" Amelia swallowed hard. "Yes, they're still out there." That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, staring out at the forest. The snow-covered branches shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the shadows seemed to shift in ways she couldn't quite explain. She thought of Toby. Of the other children, whose faces she'd only seen in the faded photographs pinned to the church walls. They were still out there. The Frostborn, trapped in a curse older than the village itself, bound by frost and shadow. Amelia pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window. "Did I really save them?" she whispered to herself. "Or did I just buy us time?" Winter faded into spring, and the snow began to melt. The forest seemed to soften under the weight of the thaw, its frozen branches dripping with crystalline droplets of water. The villagers began to repair their homes, their faces brighter under the softer sunlight. Children played in the square, their laughter carrying on the cool breeze. But Amelia never felt fully at ease. The forest was still there, just beyond the edge of the village. The trees still loomed, their shadows stretching long across the snow even in the midday sun. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she thought she could hear faint whispers drifting from the trees. "Stay. Join us. You cannot run." On the first day of summer, Amelia stood at the edge of the village, staring into the forest one last time. "Do you think it's truly over?" Martha asked, appearing beside her. Amelia shook her head. I don't think it will ever be over. Not completely. Martha sighed, her breath misting faintly in the cool air. But we'll keep going. We'll keep living. Amelia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, we will. Together, they turned and walked back toward the village, leaving the forest behind. But deep in the woods, where the altar once stood, something stirred beneath the frost. Something ancient, something hungry, and it was waiting.